She was enslaved in alien minds for years, until a human changed everything. The cave was endless, a prison of stone and shadow. Deep inside, fire lamps burned weakly, throwing strange red light across the tunnels. The air was heavy with dust. Every breath was painful. Every breath was a reminder of slavery. The alien girl moved slowly with the other slaves, her body thin, her arms covered in scars. Chains rattled around her wrists. The sound never stopped, day or night. She could not remember the last time she felt the warmth of sunlight. For her, the mine was the only world, a place where hope had been buried long ago. She had been a child when the overseers captured her. She remembered the screams of her people, the fire falling from the sky, the cold cages. Years had passed since then, maybe too many. Her body had grown, but her soul was still trapped in that first night of terror. Every day she dug into the rock, searching for the glowing crystals the overseers wanted. Every day she saw slaves collapse and never rise again. No one was free, no one was safe. The overseers were brutal creatures, tall with black armor, their eyes glowing like molten fire. They carried shock rods that burned flesh with a single touch. The slaves obeyed without question, because disobedience meant pain or death. The alien girl kept her head down, never speaking, never resisting. She had learned that silence was survival, but deep inside her, hidden even from herself, something was waiting. Her eyes sometimes glowed faintly, like tiny stars in the dark. She always turned her face away when it happened. If the overseers saw it, she knew she would be killed. So she buried her secret power the way she had buried her hope. The mine was not only stone, it was a grave for dreams. Slaves whispered only about fear, about hunger, about death. But one night, a whisper spread through the tunnels. A new captive had arrived, not one of their kind, not another alien species. This time, it was something else, something strange, something rare, a human. The girl listened as the whispers grew louder. She had never heard the word before. Human, the others said, with fear and curiosity. Some slaves said humans were weak. Others said they were dangerous. Even the guards seemed unsettled, their movements sharper, more nervous. Why would one human cause such a reaction? The girl saw him for the first time the next day, dragged through the tunnels by two overseers. His hands were bound, his face bloody, his clothes torn, but his eyes were alive. Unlike the other slaves who bent their heads, he looked. Straight ahead, he walked as if the chains were nothing. The overseers shoved him, struck him, but he did not fall. He did not beg, he did not cry. The girl felt something stir inside her chest. She had seen many prisoners before, and all of them were broken. But this one was different. There was a fire in him, a strange strength she had never seen. The overseers noticed, too. One of them whipped his back with the shock rod. The sound of burning flesh filled the tunnel. The slaves turned their faces away, waiting for the scream. But the human only gritted his teeth. And then, to everyone's shock, he smiled. The girl gasped softly. A smile. In this place, in this hell, it was madness, but it was also something else, something terrifying and beautiful. The overseers hit him again, harder. Still, he refused to bow. Still, he refused to break. The slaves whispered that night in their cages, "Who is he?" They asked, "What is he?" The girl did not speak, but she thought about his smile again and again. For years she had seen only fear, only defeat. Now she had seen something different, and though she tried to push it away, a tiny spark of hope woke inside her. The next day, she found herself watching him. He carried stones heavier than his body, yet he did not stumble. When overseers shouted, he stared at them with steady eyes. He was a prisoner, but he did not act like one. The girl could not understand him. Why was he not afraid? Why did he still fight with his spirit when his body was broken? The tunnels were still dark, the air still poisoned, the overseers still cruel. But something had changed. Something had entered the mind that even the overseers could not crush. The girl did not know his name. She did not know his story. But she knew one thing. This human was not like anyone she had ever seen. And deep in her heart, for the first time in years, she began to wonder, could there be a way out? Could freedom still exist? A mind had taken everything from her, her family, her childhood, her dreams. But now, as she watched the human, she felt the faint echo of something she thought she had lost forever. She felt the shadow of hope, and hope, once born, was a dangerous thing. The overseers did not see it yet. The slaves did not believe it yet. But the girl, silent and broken, had started to change because of him, because of a single human who refused to bow. And deep inside the endless cave, under the weight of stone and chains, the story of her new life was beginning. The sound of chains echoed through the mine, a rhythm of despair that never ended. But that day, something broke the rhythm. Heavy footsteps, sharper than before, echoed through the tunnel. The slaves lifted their heads for a moment, curiosity. Fighting with fear, two overseers dragged the human into the work chamber. His arms bound tightly behind his back. His body was bruised, his face bloodied, but his eyes still burned with that same strange fire. The alien girl felt her heart race. She had seen him once before, but now she could watch closely. The overseers shoved him into the line of slaves, forcing a heavy pickaxe into his hands. They expected him to bend, to break, to join the rhythm of suffering. But he did not move like the others. He stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, even in chains, even beaten. He looked more like a warrior than a slave. The overseers barked orders, their voices harsh. The other slaves obeyed instantly, afraid of the shock rods. But the human was slow, deliberate. He stared at the overseer, not with fear, but with challenge. The alien girl's breath caught. Did he not understand? Defiance meant death. One overseer struck him across the back with a rod. The crack of electricity filling the chamber. The smell of burning skin spread in the air. Slaves flinched. Some dropped their tools. Everyone waited for the scream. But no scream came. The human's body shook. His knees almost buckled. But he did not fall. He raised his head, and to the shock of all, he gave a small, defiant smile. A shiver ran through the girl. She had never seen such madness, such strength. That smile was not weakness. It was a weapon. It was a message, silent but powerful. "I will not bow," it said, and the overseers hated it. The second overseer stepped forward. Furious, he grabbed the human by the hair, forcing him to look up. The glow of the overseer's eyes burned inches from his face. But the human did not look away. He stared back with calm defiance. The chamber went silent. Even the clatter of tools slowed. The slaves were holding their breath. The overseers were not used to resistance. This was not normal. This was dangerous. Finally, the overseer threw him to the ground, spitting in disgust. "Work or die." The overseer growled in a language that the slaves understood. The human pushed himself up, slow but steady. He picked up the pickaxe, and then he began to work. But even in work, he was different. He swung the tool with controlled strength. Not like a broken slave, but like a fighter training for battle. His movements were strong, precise. Each strike against the stone filled with purpose. The girl could not take her eyes off him. The overseers watched too, unsettled. This was no ordinary prisoner. Hours passed. The slaves moved like shadows, but the human was like a flame among them. Exhaustion tried to pull him down, but he refused to yield. Blood dripped from his wounds. Sweat poured down his face. But still he worked, and still he carried himself like he was not theirs, like he belonged to no chain. That night, when the overseers dragged the slaves back to their cages, the girl found herself closer to him. Their cages were side by side, separated by rusted bars. She wanted to speak, but her voice was locked deep in her throat. For so many years, she had spoken. Only when forced, but something about him pulled the words out of her. "Why did you smile?" She whispered, her voice trembling. The human turned his head, his eyes catching the faint glow of the lamp. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because they want me afraid," he said softly, his voice rough but steady. "And I refuse to give them what they want." The girl froze. His words were simple, but they carried a weight she could not understand. For years, she had given the overseers what they wanted: obedience, silence, fear. But here was someone who rejected it all, someone who chose to resist, even when it meant more pain. She stared at him, her heart pounding. "Are you not afraid of dying?" She whispered. He gave a faint smile again, softer this time. "I would rather die standing than live on my knees," he said. Her chest tightened, her eyes burned. Those words struck her like lightning, because she realized, in all her years of slavery, she had never lived at all. She had only survived. And this human, this stranger, was reminding her what life could mean. The overseers shouted for silence, and the slaves closed their eyes, pretending to sleep. But the girl could not sleep. She lay in the dark, her mind spinning with his words, with his smile. She felt something dangerous inside her chest, something she thought had died long ago. Hope, and with hope came fear, because hope was forbidden. Hope was dangerous. Hope could lead to rebellion. Hope could lead to death. But as the chains rattled in the night, the girl knew something had changed. The mine was still endless, the overseers still cruel, the air still poison. But now there was a spark in the darkness, and that spark had a name: human. The overseers believed they had broken every species that passed through their minds. But perhaps, for the first time, they had made a mistake. Perhaps they had brought in someone they could not control. And if that was true, then everything was about to change. The night inside the mine was never truly dark. Dim lamps burned in the corners, casting weak red light on rows of cages. The air smelled of sweat, dust, and despair. Slaves lay motionless, their bodies too weak to move, their spirits too broken to dream. But she could not sleep. The alien girl sat curled in her corner, her eyes fixed on the shadow in the cage beside hers. The human, his back was pressed against the bars, his breathing slow and steady. Even after a full day of torment, he did not collapse like the others. He sat upright, silent but strong, as if refusing to let the mind claim his spirit. The girl's heart pounded. She wanted to speak, but fear strangled her words. For years, silence had been her shield. Speaking to the wrong person could bring punishment, but tonight her silence felt heavier than chains. Finally, in a whisper almost too soft to hear, she asked, "Why do you fight? Why do you not break like us?" The human's eyes opened slowly, glowing faintly in the dim light. He turned his head toward her, studying her face through the rusted bars. His expression was calm, but his voice carried steel. "Because once you break inside, they win forever," he said. His words were simple, but they cut deeper than any whip. The girl trembled. She had already broken inside. She thought, long ago, when the overseers took her childhood, her freedom, her people, she had buried every dream, every spark of resistance. Yet here was someone who refused to let them win, someone who still fought, even when every strike, every wound, should have crushed him. Her lips parted again. "You are not like the others," she whispered. The human gave a faint smile, the same smile that had shocked her before. "No one is like the others," he said, "but they make you believe. You are nothing, so you forget who you are." The girl's throat tightened. She wanted to cry, but tears had not come in years. Something inside her stirred, something dangerous memory. She remembered her mother's voice, long forgotten, whispering, "You are not nothing." The overseers had beaten that memory out of her, but the human's words brought it back. For the first time, she wondered if maybe she was more than a slave. The silence between them grew heavy, but not empty. The girl leaned closer to the bars, her voice trembling again. "What is your name?" The human hesitated, then spoke softly. "Daniel," he said. The sound of it felt strange in her ears, sharp and foreign, yet alive. "Daniel," she repeated, the syllables clumsy on her tongue. It was the first name she had spoken in years. It tasted like rebellion, like freedom. He tilted his head, his gaze steady. "And you?" he asked. Her chest tightened. Her name, she had hidden it so deeply, she almost forgot it. The overseers never used names, only numbers, only pain. Slowly, with a shaky breath, she whispered, "Lyra." Daniel's eyes softened. "Lyra." He repeated, as if giving the word new strength. Her name had never sounded so real, so alive. She closed her eyes, clutching that sound like a treasure, but the moment was fragile. A guard stomped past, his heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Lyra shrank back into the corner of her cage, holding her breath. The guard's molten eyes swept over the rows of slaves. For a terrifying second, she thought he had heard them, but he moved on, satisfied with silence. When the danger passed, Daniel whispered again, "Do not let them take your name." He said, "It is the first weapon you have." Lyra shivered. A weapon. She had never thought of a name as a weapon, but now the word Lyra burned in her chest like a flame. Maybe small, maybe fragile, but alive. Days passed, and in the darkness of the mine, their whispers grew, always careful, always hidden from the overseers. At first, Daniel spoke, and Lyra listened. He told her small things, fragments of his world. He spoke of open skies, of oceans that stretched forever, of fire that humans controlled. Lyra listened in wonder. The mine was the only world she knew. Yet Daniel spoke of worlds that were free, endless, beautiful in return. She told him little pieces of herself. She told him about the first time she was taken into the mines. She told him how she had once sung songs as a child. Before the overseers beat silence into her, her voice shook. But Daniel never mocked her, never judged. He only listened. His steady eyes filled with quiet respect. And slowly something happened. Lyra began to change. Her shoulders no longer slumped as low. Her eyes lifted a little higher. Daniel's words were like water in dry soil. For years, she had been nothing but a shadow. But now she felt herself growing again. Fragile, but alive. But with hope came fear. The overseers were not blind. They saw that Daniel was different. They saw the fire in his eyes. They began to watch him more closely. Their punishments harsher, their anger sharper. One day, they forced him to work in the deepest tunnel, a place where even strong slaves collapsed. Lyra's heart twisted with terror. She knew what happened. In that tunnel, no one came back alive. But when the day ended, Daniel returned, his body covered in blood, but his eyes still alive. He gave her the same defiant smile. The overseers could not kill it, and Lyra felt her own heart answering that smile. It terrified her, because she knew what it meant. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing in the mine. One night, as they sat in their cages, Daniel leaned close, his voice low. "They can break our bodies, but not our spirit, unless we let them," he whispered. Lyra's breath caught. His words were not just comfort, they were seeds of rebellion. She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not just a prisoner. She saw a leader, a warrior, a storm waiting to rise. And in her chest, beneath years of chains and scars, something powerful stirred. She was no longer afraid of speaking, no longer afraid of remembering. For the first time in years, she whispered back, her voice stronger than before, "And I will not let them win." Daniel's eyes locked with hers, and in that moment, a silent pact was made. Two souls, bound by chains, but no longer broken. The overseers did not know it yet, but a fire had been lit in the heart of the mine, a fire that would grow and burn, and one day consume everything. The mine was a world without mornings or nights. Time was measured only by pain, by hunger, by the endless sound of tools against stone. But in the heart of that endless suffering, something had begun to grow, a secret, fragile, dangerous thing. Lyra felt it each time she looked at Daniel, the way he moved, the way he carried himself, even in chains. He was not like the others. The overseers beat him, starved him, bled him, but still he did not break. Instead, he watched, always watching. The guards, the gates, the tunnels, the patterns of the overseers, and little by little, she realized Daniel was not just surviving, he was planning. One night, when the overseers left the cages in silence, Daniel leaned close to the bars. His voice was low, his eyes sharp. "Lyra," he whispered. She shivered at the sound of her name. "Yes," she whispered back. His lips curled into that faint smile, the one that never failed to stir something deep in her. "There is a way out," he said. Her heart stopped. A way out. The words felt like a dream, like madness. "No one escapes," she said quickly, fear choking her voice. Daniel shook his head, calm, steady. "Because no one tries," he said. "They have made you believe it is impossible, so you never test them." Lyra shook her head, her voice trembling. "They will kill you," she whispered. "They will kill us all." Daniel's eyes glowed faintly in the dim red light, unshaken. "Maybe," he said, "but I will not die in a cage." Those words hit her like thunder. She had lived so long in chains, she had forgotten what it meant to choose, to live, or to die with meaning. But Daniel's voice carried certainty. He was not afraid of death. He was afraid of slavery. The following days, she watched him closer. Daniel worked like the others, carrying heavy stones, breaking walls with his pickaxe. But his eyes were always moving, always searching. He noticed things others ignored. A crack in the wall where the air flowed differently. A broken gate hinge that squeaked less than the others. The overseer's habits, the way one guard always grew lazy after his shift, the way another favored his left side in battle. Every detail, every weakness, Daniel stored inside his mind. And at night, when the overseers patrolled less, he shared pieces of his thoughts with her. "There are blind spots," he said once, tracing lines in the dust with a small stone, "places they do not watch, because they think no one is bold enough to use them." Lyra stared at the marks in the dirt, her chest tight. It looked impossible. Yet Daniel spoke of it as if it was destiny. At first, she resisted. The idea of escape was poison too dangerous, too wild. But each night, as he whispered more of his plan, her resistance weakened. His words painted a picture she had never dared imagine. A sky without chains, a world where her name was not a crime, a life where her hands were not raw from stone. And slowly, the dream became harder to ignore. But Daniel was not only planning escape, he was testing her. Every day, he pushed her. When food was thrown into the cages, he gave her part of his share, even when he was starving. "Why?" she whispered once, tears stinging her eyes. He only answered, "Because you must learn to take strength, not just survive." When overseers grew violent, Daniel deliberately drew their anger toward himself. He suffered so others would not. It was reckless, dangerous. Yet it gave Lyra something she had never known before, trust, and trust was more dangerous than hope, because trust meant following. Trust meant risking everything. One night, Daniel was thrown into the cage half dead, his back torn from whips, his wrists bleeding. Lyra crawled to the bars, whispering his name in panic. "Daniel, Daniel," she begged softly. He lifted his head weakly, his eyes still burning. "They cannot stop me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. And even in that broken state, He smiled. Her tears fell silently. She hated him in that moment, hated his strength, his madness, his unbreakable spirit, because it made her believe. It made her believe. There was more than this cage, more than this mine. And belief was the one thing the overseers could never allow. The days turned into weeks. The plan grew clearer. More dangerous. It was simple, yet impossible. Use the chaos of the mining shifts. Strike when the overseers least expected. Break through the weakest tunnel. Escape into the unknown. The chance of survival was slim. But the chance of freedom was real. Lyra's heart warred with itself. One part screamed to stay silent, to remain hidden, to survive another day. But the other part, the part Daniel had awakened, burned hotter. It wanted to run, to fight, to live. Every time she saw his eyes, his smile, his defiance, the fire grew stronger, until it was no longer a question of if, but when the overseers sensed something. They began watching more closely, punishing more harshly. One even whispered among themselves that the human was dangerous, that his kind could not be broken. Daniel heard them, and his smile only grew. He had already won the first battle. They feared him, and in that fear, Lyra found her own courage. She began to whisper with other slaves when the guards were far. At first, only small words, tiny sparks, but slowly the sparks spread. Some still shook their heads in terror, but others listened. They began to believe too. One night, when the guards passed by, Daniel whispered again. "Lyra," he said, his voice steady even through bruised lips. "Yes," she answered. "Are you ready?" Her heart pounded. Her breath caught. She looked into his eyes, those eyes that had given her back her name, her hope, her fire, and she whispered, "Yes." The plan was no longer his, it was theirs, and in the silence of the mine, under the mine, weight of endless stone, two prisoners made a promise that chains would not hold forever, a promise that one day the overseers would see what it meant to challenge the spirit of a human. The mine never slept. The overseers made sure the slaves worked until their bodies collapsed. When one slave died, another was dragged in to take their place. The sound of chains, the crack of whips, the screams in the dark, it was endless. But on this day, something shifted, something dangerous, something the overseers did not see until it was too late. Daniel was at the center of it. His body was scarred, his clothes torn, his hands bleeding from the jagged rocks, yet still he moved with purpose, his eyes sharp. Every strike of his pickaxe was not just labor, it was calculation. Every glance at the guards was not fear, it was study. The overseers thought he was beaten, but he was preparing. Lyra watched him from across the tunnel, her chest tight. She could see the fire in him burning brighter than ever. She knew he was close to testing the plan, close to risking everything. The overseers were restless that day. They had seen the whispers among the slaves, the way eyes followed Daniel. They sensed rebellion in the air. So they increased their cruelty. Whips cracked harder, rods burned deeper. Fear was their weapon, and they used it mercilessly. But fear no longer held Daniel, and that terrified them. When the overseer shouted, Daniel did not bow his head. When the whip struck, he did not cry out. When they pushed him into the deepest tunnels, he walked like a soldier into battle. Then it happened. In the choking darkness, where the air was thin and the crystals glowed faintly on the walls, Daniel made his move. The overseer leaned close, his rod sparking. "Work, slave," he growled. But instead of obeying, Daniel raised his head and spoke. "No." The word was soft, but it carried like thunder. The slaves froze, their eyes wide. No one ever said no. No one ever refused. The overseer's molten eyes widened in rage. Before he could strike, Daniel moved. He dropped his pickaxe deliberately, the sound echoing through the tunnel. The overseer lunged, swinging the rod. Daniel stepped into the blow, taking the pain. his body shaking with electricity. And then, with all his strength, he rammed his shoulder into the overseer's chest. The guard staggered back, stunned. Gasps filled the tunnel. Slaves stared in shock. One man, chained, beaten, had struck an overseer. It was madness. It was suicide. But in that moment, the slaves felt something they had forgotten. Hope. The second overseer charged forward. Furious, Daniel turned, grabbing the fallen pickaxe, swinging it with desperate strength. The blade crashed against the guard's armor, sparks flying. The guard stumbled, not wounded, but surprised, and that surprise was victory enough. Lyra's heart pounded, her hands trembling. She wanted to scream, to rush forward, to help him. But fear chained her in place. She could only watch, her soul torn between terror and awe. The overseers roared, their voices shaking the walls. More guards rushed into the tunnel, their rods crackling with deadly light. Daniel stood his ground, chest heaving, blood dripping down his face, but his eyes were unbroken, his voice steady. "You cannot break me," he said, and every slave heard it. The guards struck him again and again, blows raining down like thunder. His body crumpled under the force, his blood staining the stone. Still, he refused to scream. Still, he refused to bow. Finally, one guard struck him so hard the pickaxe flew from his hands. Daniel fell to his knees, his body shaking. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She thought he was finished. She thought this was the end. But Daniel raised his head, slowly, painfully, his face broken, his body weak, and still he smiled. That smile was not defiance alone. It was a message. It said, "I am still here. I am still human, and you cannot take that from me." The overseers froze, their fury mixing with fear. For the first time, they realized what they were facing. Not just a slave, but a spark they could not crush. The slaves saw it too, for years. They had believed escape was impossible. But now, as Daniel bled before them, they saw that chains could be resisted, that overseers could be defied, and hope, once seen, could not be unseen. The guards dragged Daniel back to the cages, his body limp. They wanted to make an example of him. They threw him against the bars, laughing as he collapsed inside. "See what happens when you resist." One growled, but the laughter died when Daniel lifted his head again, his voice a broken whisper. "See what happens when you fight." Lyra rushed to the bars, her eyes wet. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice shaking. He turned his head slowly, his smile faint but alive. "Not yet," he whispered. "Not done." Her tears fell freely. She pressed her hands against the bars, wishing she could reach him. She hated him in that moment, hated his madness, his refusal to surrender, because it made her believe. It made her believe escape was not only possible, it was inevitable. That night, the slaves did not sleep. They whispered in the dark, voices trembling, hearts racing. "What if he is right?" One said, "What if we can fight?" Said another, for the first time, the mind was filled not with silence, but with whispers of rebellion, and Lyra, broken for so many years, felt herself standing taller. Her fear was still there, but beneath it, something stronger had taken root. If Daniel could fight through the pain, if he could smile through death, then she could stand too. She could be more than a slave. The overseers had tried to break him, but instead they had lit a fire, and that fire was spreading. The mine was a beast of stone and fire. It had swallowed thousands of slaves, grinding them into dust and silence. The overseers believed no one could ever defy it. But that night, a beast stirred with something it had never known before. Rebellion. Daniel lay in his cage, his body broken, his breath shallow, every rib screamed in pain, his skin burned with whip scars, yet his eyes were alive, sharp as blades in the dark. Lyra knelt by the bars, her heart pounding, her voice trembling. "You cannot fight again. she whispered. "They will kill you." Daniel's lips curled into that faint, maddening smile. "Then we kill them first," he whispered back. The words sent a shiver through her. It was madness. It was suicide. And yet it was freedom. For so long she had lived with silence. But now her blood burned with his fire. She whispered back, "Tell me what to do." Daniel leaned close, his voice weak but steady. "They change guards during the next cycle," he said. "They grow lazy between shifts, tired, careless." He pointed weakly toward the cracks in the wall near the cages. "The rock there is weak. We can break it, but we must act fast." Lyra's breath caught, the plan he had studied, the details he had whispered night after night. It was real now, and once they began, there would be no turning back. Hours crawled by, every second heavy with dread. The overseers patrolled the tunnels, their eyes burning, their rods crackling. The slaves pretended to sleep, but their hearts pounded like war drums. They knew tonight could be the end, or the beginning. Finally, the signal came. The heavy footsteps of the changing guards echoed through the stone. The overseers left the cages unguarded for a breath too long. Daniel's eyes locked with Lyra's. "Now," he whispered. Lyra's hands shook as she grabbed a loose shard of crystal. She jammed it into the crack in the wall, twisting, breaking. Another slave joined her, then another. The sound of stone breaking filled the air. Hidden beneath the noise of the guard change, the wall crumbled faster than she expected. Dust rained down, air rushed through a tunnel. A way out, but before hope could rise too high, a guard turned, his burning eyes catching the movement. "Stop!" he roared, rushing forward. Lyra froze in terror, her heart ready to collapse, but Daniel moved. With a roar of pain and fury, he slammed his body against the cage door. The rusted bars groaned, then snapped. The guard's eyes widened in shock. As Daniel burst forward, his hands still chained, his body bleeding, but his spirit unstoppable, Daniel charged, slamming into the overseer, the impact shaking the ground. The guard swung his rod, electricity sparking. Daniel caught it with his chained hands, screaming as the energy burned his flesh. And then, with a violent twist, he tore the rod free. For the first time, a slave held the weapon of a master. The other slaves gasped, their fear turning into something else. Lyra's heart surged, her voice breaking into a cry she never thought she'd make. "Fight!" She screamed, and the mine erupted. Slaves surged from their cages, fueled by years of suffering. They grabbed rocks, tools, chains, anything they could find. The overseers shouted, their rods crackling, but the tide had turned. For every whip strike, 2 slaves struck back. For every scream, there was now a roar of defiance. Daniel swung the rod like a blade, its energy tearing through armor. A guard fell, sparks flying from his broken weapon. Another lunged at him, but Daniel ducked, driving his chained fists into the creature's throat. He fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. He fought like a man who had already won. Lyra stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the chaos. But then an overseer charged at her, rod raised high. Her fear exploded into fury. Her eyes burned with the power she had hidden for so long. A burst of light shot from her hands, slamming into the overseer. The creature flew backward, crashing against the wall. Stunned, the slaves around her stopped, their eyes wide. Lyra stood trembling, her hands glowing. For years she had buried her power, terrified it would bring death. But now it brought freedom, and with a scream, she unleashed it again. Blasting another guard into the dust, the battle raged like a storm. The overseers fought with fury, but they were outnumbered. Slaves who once cowered now tore into their masters with rage. The mine shook with the sound of rebellion. Daniel and Lyra fought side by side, he with the stolen rod, she with her burning power. They cut a path through the overseers, their bodies moving as one. She saved him when a guard struck from behind. He shielded her when her strength faltered. Together, they were unstoppable. But victory was not yet certain. More overseers rushed from the deeper tunnels. Their armor glowing, their rods blazing, the slaves faltered, their courage shaking. The overseers were too strong, too many. The fire of rebellion threatened to be snuffed. Out, Daniel saw it, saw the fear returning, and he roared, his voice echoing through the tunnels. Do not stop. They bleed like we bleed. They fall like we fall. His words cut through the chaos like lightning. The slaves roared back, charging with renewed fury. Lyra felt her chest burn, her power surging like never before. She raised her hands, and the light burst forth, brighter, hotter, unstoppable. It struck the tunnel ceiling, stone cracking, dust raining down. The ground shook, the overseers stumbled. And in that chaos, the slaves pushed forward. The weak wall crumbled completely, revealing the tunnel beyond. Cold air rushed in, the taste of freedom. Daniel grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her toward the opening. Now! He shouted. The slaves surged after them, pouring into the tunnel like a flood. The overseers roared in fury, striking wildly. Some slaves fell, their bodies broken, their cries echoing in the dark. But more kept running, more kept fighting. For the first time, they were not slaves, they were free. Even before they reached the end, Daniel staggered, his body ready to collapse. But he forced his legs to move, forced his hands to strike, because he knew this was it. This was the moment everything changed. The tunnel narrowed, the walls shaking, rocks fell, dust choked the air. Behind them, overseers screamed, their fury shaking the stone. But ahead was light, not the dim red glow of the mine, but something pure, something real. Lyra's heart pounded, her eyes wide. She had never seen it before, never even dared imagine it. But now it was there. The stars, the slaves poured. Out of the tunnel, their chains broken, their eyes wide with wonder. Above them stretched the endless sky, glittering with 1,000 points of light. Lyra fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. After years of darkness, she was free, and beside her, Daniel stood, his body bloody, his chest heaving, but his eyes were bright, his smile alive. He had done the impossible. He had broken. The chains, the overseers stood at the mouth of the tunnel, roaring in rage, but the slaves no longer cowered. They no longer bowed. They stood tall, their spirits unbroken, and at their front stood Daniel and Lyra, the spark and the flame, the human and the alien girl, the beginning of a new dawn. The night sky stretched above them like an endless ocean of light. The stars glittered, sharp and bright, strange and beautiful. For the slaves, it was the first time in years, maybe in their whole lives, that they had seen freedom above their heads. For Lyra, it was more than light. It was rebirth. She stood, trembling at the mouth of the broken tunnel, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with tears. The cold air touched her skin, strange and soft compared to the choking dust of the mine. She had dreamed of this moment, but never truly believed it would come. And now, here it was, the sky, the stars, freedom around her. The other slaves cried, shouted, laughed, some falling. To their knees, kissing the dirt, their chains were still heavy. Their bodies broken, but their spirits soared. For the first time, they were not prisoners. They were not slaves. They were alive. But victory had not come without cost. The cries of the wounded echoed in the night. Some had fallen in the escape, left behind in the collapsing tunnels. And even now, the overseers roared from below, their fury carrying through the stone.